From Penn State University, this is Pennsylvania Inside Out, connecting communities to a world of creativity and knowledge. Here's tonight's host, Patty Satalia.
Welcome to Pennsylvania Inside Out. From 1951 until 1974, hundreds of Philadelphia prisoners were used as human guinea pigs in an array of unethical and oftentimes dangerous medical experiments. The experiments left many test subjects, most of whom were African Americans, in excruciating pain and with long-term health problems. Our guests are Alan Hornblum, author of Sentenced to Science, One Black Man's Story of Imprisonment in America. He's the first person to shine a light on this dark chapter in American medical history. Also with us is Eddie Anthony, now known as Yusuf Anthony. His story is the focus of Hornblum's book, which is published by Penn State Press. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Patty.
Well, how did you first learn that Holmesburg Prison inmates were being used as test subjects?
Well, I witnessed it. I was actually just out of graduate school, and I decided in the early 70s that I wanted to do some positive work for society rather than completing my graduate education. So I started working in the Philadelphia prisons, and it was on my initial tours through the complex of prisons in Philly that I saw scores of men wearing adhesive tape and bandages and all sorts of wraps around their heads and backs and arms, and I couldn't imagine the prison was that safe. You know, were these, knife fights on a cell block or a gang war in the prison yard? And the next day I asked the guard on the cell block, what's with all these guys who were strapped in wrap and adhesive tape and bandages? He says, oh, that's nothing, that's just the perfume test for the University of Pennsylvania. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, they're doing perfume experiments. And it was so ridiculous to see these men who were, in many cases, killers and rapists and burglars and robbers, testing perfume. I couldn't imagine it. But in fact, what I had learned was that experiments had been going on, medical experiments, serious invasive procedures, for 20 years before I ever got there.
And not just cosmetics and perfumes.
Absolutely. I thought that was in the minority if there was any perfume. They were doing just anything you can imagine, from the innocuous to the truly dangerous.
Now, was this an anomaly in Holmesburg Prison, or is this something that's gone on in other prisons across the country?
It was widespread in the Cold War years in America. From the end of the Second World War to the mid-70s, at least half the states had one prison that were hosting prison medical experiments. Pennsylvania, unfortunately, led the way with at least 10 prisons that were doing this. And it was quite common during those post-war years where institutionalized populations were being used as human guinea pigs by the medical community.
Your book really is an indictment of the Philadelphia prison system and the medical community. How did the two come to work together?
Well, it was obviously a marriage of convenience. There were folks in the pharmaceutical community and the medical community who wanted to do clinical trials. The University of Pennsylvania is a big research operation, so it was convenient to them and everybody if they could find cheap and available test subjects, and that's what the prison system afforded them. The inmates themselves were desperate to make money, not particularly well educated, so they naturally gravitated to a test where they could make far more money being a guinea pig than they could pushing a broom on a cell block.
Was it money that lured you to do your first test?
Yes, it was money, and the fact that I didn't have people coming up to visit me at the time to put money on the books for me so I could go to the commissary at the store. And also they was using it to get bail money if you had low bail. Could possibly get out on bail by participating in the tests, That's basically what lured me, you know what I mean?
Tell us about your first test.
They signed me to Johnson & Johnson bubble bath test. And I went over there, and if you ever seen the cover of Acres of Skin, they have a guy sitting on the table with patches on his back. Well, they put 6 patches on my back of bubble bath. But it was the solution they sprayed on my back to seal the pores on my back so that the tape would stick on, so that my back wouldn't sweat, and it was very toxic. That got into my bloodstream, and it poisoned me, and I'm still suffering from that particular test right now today. My hands and stuff broke out, my feet.
If we had a shot of your fingernails, we can see that your fingernails are rougher than normal
and
fingernails.
They were a half-inch thick.
And these look good now. These look good now compared to the way they were when I was incarcerated and through the years. You know, they was like, my one finger was the size of 2 fingers. And my fingernails was growing like claws. And in fact, before my hands and feet broke out, my whole body was inflamed after the poison got into my system. It was benzoids and isotopes in the chemicals in the can. And I was sensitive to it.
Is it likely that he really wasn't testing bubble bath?
Probably was not, but we don't know for sure. These men were actually treated like guinea pigs. They weren't told exactly what it was. In many cases, they were deceived. I haven't found anybody who knew that they were being injected with radioactive isotopes or were told they were being involved in a test with Dow Chemical where dioxin was being placed on their faces and backs. So in many cases, just like you would not tell a guinea pig, this is what I'm going to do to you today, they did this with human beings in the prison system.
And it wasn't just the University of Pennsylvania Medical School involved in this. It was also the Army and the CIA. There was military testing going on as well.
If you were in the business of testing products or wanting to put a product on the market, you knew about Dr. Kligman, University of Pennsylvania, and Holmesburg Prison. They were infamous, notorious in the field of human experimentation. So you had Dow Chemical in Michigan coming to Philadelphia. You had R.J. Reynolds in North Carolina for tobacco cancer tests coming to Philadelphia. You had the Army in Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, coming to Philadelphia because they knew that was a site where you could get anything tested on people.
So those are the contractors who are
correct.
Paying. You're making a little bit of money. The prison's making a fair amount of money.
They're making more, and the doctors and the major proprietors, you know, the chemical companies, pharmaceutical companies, are making the big bucks.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago Mr. Hornblum's first book, Acres of Skin, Human Experiments at Holmesburg Prison, A True Story of Abuse and Exploitation in the Name of Medical Science. When that book came out, you and others in the Philadelphia community, I think, were astounded to read that this was your story out there.
That's right. And we thought that we didn't have a case or a way to go, you know, get recompense for what we went through. But after the book came out, we decided to come up with a class action lawsuit because we found that it's a law called the rule of discovery. We thought we had signed away our rights when we were incarcerated, and we found out that the papers that they used was illegal. But when the book came out, it pointed, you know, to the direction that they had misused us. So we came up with the class action lawsuit, but we never got through the courts. You know what I mean?
Well, you bring up an interesting point. One of the hallmarks of the Nuremberg medical trials from 1933 to 1945, Nazi doctors used concentration camps in much the way as the Holmesburg prisons were used, was a code of ethics. And one of the codes is informed consent.
First principle.
Explain what that is, and then I'm going to talk to you about what you thought you were getting.
Well, one of the very sad chapters of American medical history in the 20th century is that we tried the Nazi doctors. We harangued them. We told them what proper research medicine is like. We executed 7 of them. Then we write this excellent code of 10 principles, but we never bought into it ourselves. It was remarkable. We told other countries how to do it. Many of them bought into it, but we ourselves moved into the Gilded Age of research in the 1950s, where we were using retarded subjects, we were using the emotionally disturbed, we were using pregnant women, all sorts of people who were institutionalized were grist for the research mill, and that was very sad. With regard to that first principle, it also goes into the fact that the test subjects should not be in a confined or coercive environment, which is particularly poignant to the story of Acres of Skin and Sentenced to Science. Our history of using prison inmates is a pretty bleak one, and unfortunately the government is actually thinking of returning to it again. So it's something that Youssef and I are very much opposed to.
What did you think you were getting into?
Well, they coerced you to believe that the tests were safe, you know, and you know you weren't taking a chance or anything. But when you go over there, they gave you a simple piece of paper that read like, if something was to happen to you after the test, you can't hold the University of Pennsylvania responsible. So right there, you would automatically question it. I thought they were safe. They said, they tell you, this is just a formality. Just, you know, you just have to have your signature to make it believe that it was, you know, everything was all right. But after they got you over there, and if you got sick, they didn't have no aftercare in place or nothing, you know. Like, this happened to me in 1964, and here it is, 2007, I'm still suffering from that, you know.
I want to get back to that in just a moment. This is Pennsylvania Inside Out on WPSU. I'm Patty Satalia. In his new book, Sentenced to Science, author Alan Hornblum tells the disturbing story of Eddie Anthony's days as a Holmesburg prison test subject. The book is a searing indictment of the criminal justice and medical communities that disdainfully used Philadelphia inmates as human guinea pigs in an array of unethical and questionable experiments. Our guests are author Alan Hornblum and former test subject Eddie, now Yusuf Anthony. Despite the experience of your first test, and I have to say that your inmates, your cellmates, were fortunate enough to undergo more innocuous tests, you signed up to do more because the need for money in prison is a strong one.
And prison being such a dangerous place. You know, you had the test offered you a thing of being independent, where you didn't have to depend on friends or other inmates, and it was a corrupt environment. So if you had money on the books, you know, this put a little safety on your stay in incarceration. So, you know, like after the money runs out, which was a little bit of money for each test.
Give us an idea of what you might get paid.
Well, the first test I was on, in which I'm still suffering from today, this was 1964, I got something like $30-something. You know, I didn't have to participate in the whole test because of the fact I broke out so bad about the first week. And they told me, well, you don't have to do the rest of the test. And we're going to pay you the whole amount. And the whole amount was $30-something for a 21-day, having patches put on my back every day with big blisters breaking out on me. And then eventually my whole body broke out as if I had German measles.
And people didn't recognize you. In fact, they steered away from you when you went to the mess hall.
When I went to the mess hall, they refused to sit down beside me, afraid it was contagious. It would get something, so they had to feed me on the blocks. You know what I mean? This is how bad it was. And then after you get out of jail, they got me controlled. Then when I got out, it broke out again in the street. I had nowhere to go to. They had no aftercare in place for, you know, that you could go for refuge or for treatment. So I wound up going to the PGH, and when I did finally get there,
What's the PGH?
It was the Philadelphia General Hospital. And it's no longer in existence, but my hands and feet, the stuff that was in my whole body came down to my hands and feet. My hands were big as 8-ounce boxing gloves. I wear 10.5 shoe. I couldn't get my foot in a 14 AAA when they took me in there. And they had me hospitalized for a whole month. And I had to be treated twice for this. Here lately, I haven't got no positive diagnosis of what I got wrong with me. It's something in my blood. I break out every time the weather gets warm. I break out again. You know, they give me a little salve to bring it under control, but I never get rid of it.
You know, in addition to the physical and emotional trauma of having gone through this, the African-American community seems to be distrustful of the American medical system in general, not because just this, but also because of Tuskegee, the syphilis experiments, and other things. Talk a little bit about that.
The African-American community is very reluctant to deal with doctors in the medical community. They have very low rates of participation in contributions on body parts and transplants and visiting doctors and what have you. And it's not just the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is probably the most infamous case of unethical medicine, but all of these other cases that are out there that maybe haven't, you know, digested in the American Caucasian mind. But for example, in Philadelphia, unfortunately, there are so many African Americans who have had relatives who went through Holmesburg for that quarter century. They have heard from fathers or grandfathers or brothers what happened, and you know, the circle of friends that Eddie and all the other thousands were used in, they really become legitimately distrustful of the American medical community.
Explain, if you would, the experiments were conducted, quote, under the direction of University of Pennsylvania dermatologist Albert Kligman is someone you mentioned in your book. What exactly did under the direction of mean?
Well, it meant that it was basically his operation. He walks into Holmesburg Prison back in 1951, ostensibly to help out with another outbreak of ringworm and athlete's foot. But he's a very bright, creative guy. And right away, you know, he recognized the potential for research medicine. He sees an institution with 1,200 people, and as he thought to himself and said many times over and over, there were acres of skin in there that you could use for medical experimentation. So he meets with the superintendent of the prison subsequent to that, and he says, I think I can help you out, maybe you can help me. And over a handshake, they develop a system that runs for a quarter century.